I'm not a lawyer, but we back. It was day one of Karen Read 2.0, also known as the retrial of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Karen Read. And I'm going to give you the recap, but before I do, I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is I'm going on vacation, so after this recap, I probably won't do another one until day like 10. But the good news is you're going to get this recap. So let's get into it. As a reminder, Karen Read is facing 3 charges.
The first one, second-degree murder. We are not going to try to prove that Karen Read tried to kill John O'Keefe. We're not going to try to prove to you that she intended or wanted him dead. That's not second-degree murder. What we'll prove to you is she engaged in an intentional act, driving back at him at that speed, in the storm, in the darkness, knowing that he had just gotten out of her Lexus. She intended that act, which would cause a plain and strong likelihood of death. Also, operating under the influence of alcohol, manslaughter will prove to you that she drove her Lexus recklessly. She hit John O'Keefe, and because she hit him and he fell back, she caused his death. The third charge is leaving the scene after knowingly causing death. Again, she hit Mr. O'Keefe with a car. She knew he was injured. She left him behind, and he died.
Now, those clips were of the prosecutor, Hank Brennan, who was not on the team for the last trial, but is the lead prosecutor for this one. And today, he gave opening statements, and like the prosecutor from the last trial, Hank Brennan talked about Karen and John's relationship and highlighted that it was on the verge of ending.
It was a steady relationship until about the beginning of 2022. And then things began to unravel. There was tension, there was arguments. In fact, just a few days before this incident, you'll hear that Mr. O'Keefe asked her to leave. You're going to be able to read text messages of their conversations on January 28, 2022, and you will see the tension and the unraveling of the relationship. You will read about the discord between the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe.
And according to Hank Brennan, drinking plus anger from an argument is what led up to John O'Keefe's death, and he emphasizes multiple times to the jury that he plans on using facts, science, and data to prove that Karen Read is responsible for John O'Keefe's death.
So why are we here today? We are here today because John O'Keefe was killed by the actions and conduct of that defendant, Karen Read. Follow the science, follow the data. Ignore speculation, surmise, conjecture. Stay true to the evidence. It will lead you to the truth. You will learn through this case, through facts, science, and data, you will learn that on January 29, 2022, a very intoxicated defendant was angry and arguing about the relationship with John O'Keefe. And after the fight was over, she left, but she brought the fight back to him in the form of her SUV. She clipped him, he fell backwards, he broke his head, and then this man who helped, a lifetime of help, was left at the corner of that yard, left to die with no help. The evidence will make clear that she knew he was there. She did not call 911. She did not go back to him. She did not leave an anonymous tip. She left.
Hank Brennan also made sure to tell the jury that Karen Read has done a ton of interviews since being charged in this case, and they plan to use her own words against her because anything you say can and will be used against you.
2020 Nightline, Fox 25, a documentary, and we've had an opportunity to get many of her statements in the footage, and we're going to show much of you. And her statements to you will confirm what you already know from the science and data, what you will already conclude from the facts independent about what she did that night. Her word is simply confirmed.
Okay, now let's get into the defense's opening statements. For the last trial, Karen's attorney David Yannetti gave the opening, but for this one, her attorney Alan Jackson gives the opening. And the theme he focuses on is that John O'Keefe was not hit by a car.
The evidence in this case will establish above everything else 3 points. There was no collision with John O'Keefe. There was no collision. There was no collision. John O'Keefe did not die from being hit by a vehicle. Period. That's why we're here. A collision. And there's no evidence of one. Zero. John O'Keefe's injuries did not come from being struck by a vehicle. Therefore, as I said, there was no collision. There was no collision. That there was no collision. And that science will tell you with certainty there was no collision with John O'Keefe. Dr. Laposada will tell you with medical certainty that, in fact, John was not struck by a vehicle. Therefore, as I said, there was no collision. You will learn that John did not have a single injury consistent with being hit by a car. Because at the end of the day, folks, there was no collision with John O'Keefe.
Now, Jackson also began setting up the idea of the cover-up, mentioning that Brian Albert got rid of his phone, his dog, and his house, and that John's injuries are less consistent with being hit by a car and more consistent with being bitten by a dog.
The evidence will show that these injuries are from an animal, like a large dog, like the large dog that was inside the Albert house that night. You'll also learn that oddly, very oddly, after having their family pet for 7 years, a short time after this incident, the Alberts got rid of that dog. They called it rehoming her, but she was gone.
One new and very interesting thing from this opening is Alan Jackson says John O'Keefe did not die from hypothermia.
But the doctor will tell you something more, and just as important. She'll tell you that John O'Keefe did not suffer from hypothermia, as the Commonwealth will undoubtedly allege. His body showed no signs of it, no frostbite, no cold-induced injuries to his organs. Ladies and gentlemen, the scientific evidence and the medical evidence will establish that John O'Keefe had to be injured somewhere else, somewhere warmer, and his body had to have been moved out into the cold. And that's where, ultimately at 6 a.m., Karen found him the next morning.
That feels like a big deal, because if he was truly out there from 12:30 when Karen allegedly hit him until 6 a.m. when Karen found him, that would have been close to 6 hours. Now, I'm not a doctor, but 6 hours in blizzard temperatures seems like he would have gotten hypothermia. And then he highlights what we all expected, that Michael Proctor, the lead investigator for this case, has been fired for his work on this case. And that alone is enough for reasonable doubt.
So how did we end up here? How does Karen Read end up sitting in that chair on trial for an event that literally never happened? Well, the evidence is going to explain it. And it can be summed up in the following text message, a text message of a now fired Massachusetts State Police officer named Michael Proctor. He was the lead investigator on this case, and he was talking about a fellow officer, a fellow cop, who owned the property where John O'Keefe's body was found. Text message with a buddy. Question, is the homeowner going to catch any shit? Answer, nope. He's a Boston cop too. Do you have any idea how hard it is for a state trooper to get fired? Well, the evidence is going to show that Michael Proctor earned it, every bit of it.
Saying someone earned being fired is hilarious.
More shockingly, you'll learn that lead investigator for the Massachusetts Police, Michael Proctor, never set foot inside Brian Albert's house, never separated and secured witnesses. He never properly collected evidence. He never secured the evidence. He never searched for signs of a struggle inside or outside the home. He never properly canvassed the neighborhood. Michael Proctor never did any of these things. He was the lead investigator on the case officer, the architect of the entire prosecution. You'll learn there's not a single part of this case, folks, not a single part, that he didn't touch, that he didn't direct, that he didn't orchestrate personally. Every single bit of it has his fingerprints on it. And he's been disgraced by his own agency, by the Massachusetts State Police. Investigated, suspended, and fired. The evidence will show that Massachusetts State Police found him guilty, found Michael Proctor guilty of bringing dishonor to the department for his conduct, not in some other case, not in some tangential case. In this case, the investigation of Karen Read. By the end of this trial, you'll conclude that Karen Read is not guilty of hitting John O'Keefe with her SUV. There was no collision.
After openings, the Commonwealth